Hello, everyone. Mark is back. So the this week and next week, the lectures are kind of largely intertwined. They have to do with kind of the creation of modern the modern world system in terms of the bases of our economic models, the bases of our race history and race relations and socioeconomic differences, and also, it kind of touches on how like the major political players in the world came to be in terms of like so-called first world versus third world, or developed world versus developing world, or the West versus the rest, or the global North versus the global South. All these terms can be used, but depending on your preference. But basically, like, how did this type of arrangement come to be? And the goal of this is to show you a few things. One, that everything has a history behind it. Like, nothing is predestined, in the sense that, like, oftentimes I think we tend to look at a snapshot of the world as it is today, and we imagine that this is the natural order of things, or this is the way things have always been, or we have a very static view of things. And this is to show how intricately linked all different kinds of events are in history, and how what we're seeing today is kind of the fluorescence of that, and how things that are going on today are going to impact the future in ways we probably don't even know yet. So again, this is all part of turning the lens on our own society, because the beginning of the class is about general anthropological concepts, and those are usually demonstrated by looking at other societies, because it helps to step out of your own frame of reference, so you can look at things a little bit more analytically and learn how to do that. And then you can come back and you can start to use that to dissect your own society and look at gender roles, or economics or political systems, how those came to be, you know, what maintains power structures as they are. So, anyway, that's just a quick introduction. So, a lot of the themes that we're talking about in this lecture about the relationship between capitalism and slavery are going to be brought up again in the next three lectures. So forgive me if I repeat a lot of it. I will try to keep that to a relative minimum. So first of all, we need to go back. We already talked about this, but we need to go back and review, like, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about capitalism? It hasn't always looked exactly like what you see on the screen here. So some characteristics of a capitalist economic system, some key ones, is number one, the goal of production is to create surplus wealth. It's not simply to survive. It's not simply to have savings for a rainy day. It's explicitly the creation of wealth that can then be reinvested. So the capitalist mode of production, remember we talked about the mode of production, is based on private ownership of the means of production. So the means of production are all the technology, all of the factories and equipment, all of the raw materials that you need in order to produce whatever you're producing. And, according to a Marxian analysis or terminology, this broad group of people who incorporates a lot of people. We're not just talking about like CEOs of corporations. This could be down to small business owners. Are just terminologically called the capitalists. And then there are workers who don't own the means of production, so they, for the most part, are not producing everything that they need for their own sustenance, right? They're generally not producing their own food, or at least not all of it. They're not making their own clothes, or at least not all of them. They're not building their own houses from materials that they own on their property, typically. So workers have to sell what they have, which is their labor, and their knowledge and social capital. So you do that in order to get a wage, and then you use that wage and you go back to a capitalist, and I'm putting it in air quotes because I think like the rhetoric has gotten to a point where you say capitalist and you assume someone is saying something derogatory, but I'm just using this terminology. So you go and you purchase from a capitalist or a capitalist enterprise the things that you need or want, rather than produce them yourselves, right? Now, the capitalist class, who's, whether you're running a small business or a large corporation, you want to get profit, not only so that you can kind of pay yourself, but so that you can reinvest in your business, right? You can expand, you can buy more franchises, you can invest in technology. You want to get an edge so that you become more competitive against other businesses, and you can sort of expand that way. So that's something unique as an economic system compared to other economic systems that have and do exist. Another characteristic is innovation. So in order to increase your profit, you have to find ways to become more efficient. And that may mean inventing or adopting new technologies, finding ways to motivate your workforce through compensation plans or other means, or just making a better product or making your product more cheaply. So that's all key to gain an edge in market competition. And the mode of exchange in a capitalist system is based on the principle of supply and demand. It's a market system. So the value of goods or services on the market are not directly tied to their use value, i.e. how useful they are to you in your life. They are tied to supply and demand, which is governed by market interactions. So compare that to some other modes of production. So here we see a kin-based mode of production. These are a group of the San from the Kalahari in southeastern Africa. And how is their, how do they divide their labor? Well, there's some things that everybody does together. Some things might be divided by age. Some things might be divided by gender. But that's all based on sort of kinship and family structures, as opposed to a class that owns the means of production and a class that doesn't own the means of production. Everybody here owns the means of production, whether it's these digging sticks or what you need to make bows and arrows, or clothing or shoes or whatnot. The same goes for small-scale agriculture. Now, I'm not 100% sure of what the context is that I grabbed this picture from. This may well be a cash crop. It probably is a cash crop. So these people are almost certainly part of a larger capitalist system. But you see, let's just say for the sake of argument, a husband and a wife out there doing the work together. So you can imagine small-scale agriculture in a non-capitalist society in which, again, it's a kin-based mode of subsistence, or a kin-based mode of production, rather. So you're dividing, again, up the labor by age and by gender and so on. Pastoralists also have traditionally had a similar kin-based system, right? And a lot of things are broken up by gender and by age. And then there's the feudal system of the Middle Ages in Europe, which was a tributary mode of production, where a noble class or an aristocratic class would own the land, but they would rent it out to serfs, or they would demand tribute from the serfs. So the serfs had access to the means of production, although they didn't technically own them. They could provide, at least at some points during the feudal system, most of what they would need. They could make themselves or grow themselves, but they had to give a portion of it to the lord who owned the land. All right, and then you have sort of early industrial capitalism where you have laborers, and they don't own, in this case, these children, they don't own these spinning machines, they don't own the raw cotton. They are trying to earn a wage for their family, and they're selling their labor to someone or someones who own the factory, basically. In a lot of the early industrial capitalism, the labor was very exploitative in the sense that, who do you notice in these pictures? Mostly children, women, people who are marginalized because of, codified racial differences in terms of how people are treated. And why are they used? Because they could provide labor at a low cost. So the roots of the modern capitalist system can be and are debated by historians and anthropologists and so on and so forth, because there's a lot of different strands that were woven together to get the capitalism that we know today. So one strand might go to the Industrial Revolution. Another strand might go a little bit further to early, sort of colonization. Another strand might go to the Age of Discovery. Another strand might go to the late Middle Ages. But two types of capitalism that existed before industrial and post-industrial capitalism were mercantile capitalism, which is what this picture with the ship represents, and agrarian capitalism, which is what is represented here. I won't go too much into either of those in this lecture, a little bit into mercantile capitalism, because we will talk more about it in some of the upcoming lectures. But what was different here is that not everybody was tied into a market system. So with mercantile capitalism, you had people who were already wealthy. So whether those are aristocrats and minor aristocrats, or a merchant class, or burghers, or like city dwellers, it wasn't something that was generally participated in by the majority of the population that was agricultural. Those people were still sort of living in a system that was not entirely market-based. Whereas in agrarian capitalism, that's more like really, really early. I don't even know if you could call it capitalism, but it's where innovation started to creep into agricultural production, and there were new motivations for peasants and serfs to try to improve the technologies that they were using and make their agriculture more efficient, and start to sell surpluses in marketplaces. So those are some of the beginnings, but just to show you kind of the world system, the connections in the world on the eve of greater expansion, prior to a true capitalist system. You had trade routes, extensive trade routes through all the world. I mean, here we know in medieval times, here it says in the medieval Islamic world, but this brought together Europe, Africa, West Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. There were all these trade routes. And, a lot of those are connected to like the Silk Road and things like that. And, there were even trade routes across the Sahara, where things from West Africa, maybe gold or maybe textiles, would be traded for, who knows, spices. There was even some slave trade, although it wasn't nearly on the scale of like the chattel system that came about during the transatlantic slave system. But there was trucking and trading in people, not only between Africa and the Islamic world, but between Europe and the Islamic world, and maybe Southern Europe and Africa, and in the Americas as well. And this is not it. This is obviously just kind of the current United States, a little bit of Canada, and a little bit of Mexico. So there were more trade routes than this, but this just goes to show you connections in sort of the indigenous Americas as well. So globalization is not something super new, but the scale of globalization really began to increase drastically during the Age of Discovery and then colonialism, and has obviously sort of exponentially sped up. But prior to this Age of Discovery, as you can see here, a lot of the routes that were connecting Europe and parts of Africa and Asia were land routes. There were also sea routes, but as far as Europe was concerned, the sea routes were mostly in the Mediterranean, and the rest of the routes were overland. These sea routes were largely controlled, I believe, by Islamic empires. Maybe the early Ottoman Empire was part of it. A lot of the countries along the Indian, or maybe they weren't exactly countries then, but polities along the Indian Ocean were involved. China was involved. But what began to change sometime in, I believe, the 15th century, so we're talking prior to Columbus, was that there were more powerful states that were starting to dominate trade in the areas that they had reign over. One of which was the Ottoman Empire, which obviously included Turkey, eventually parts of Europe, Egypt and North Africa, and so on and so forth. And, that obviously covered a large portion of, a key portion of the land routes between Europe and further east. Also, the Venetians, who are on this side of Italy, were a very powerful trading powerful power. And so the countries that were on the Atlantic seaboard and the Western Mediterranean, so, I guess in this case we're talking mostly about what's now Portugal and Spain, they saw their profits cut into greatly because the Venetians controlled a lot, the Ottoman Empire controlled a lot, so the Spanish and the Portuguese would have to kind of trade with the middlemen, and that would cut down on what they were able to get when they sold it, right? Because instead of going to get the things that they were trading, whether they were spices, they were mostly spices, but gold, silver, textiles, whatnot. Instead of going to get those themselves, they would have to buy them from Ottoman traders or Venetian traders, and then they would go on and trade them again. So it would cut down on their margins. Also, the Portuguese at the time, had to deal with parts of Spain that had just recently kind of kicked the Moorish, Islamic Moorish rulers out of Spain. And so Portugal would have to deal with Spain in order to get access to this. So Portugal started to explore a bit, because people up until that time in Europe often thought that the Indian Ocean was landlocked and the only way to get there was an overland route. But there were some that said, no, we can probably go around. And so there were these voyages to try and see, can we go around Africa to get to the Indian Ocean? And not the first to go around southern tip of Africa, but one of the first to make the entire journey around, and perhaps the first to go to India through a completely sea route, was Vasco da Gama, who was Portuguese, right? So this is the route that he took. So between 1497 and 1498, Some Portuguese trading colonies were established in India, different rest ports and maybe trading ports in Africa. And then Spain decides it wants in on that action, and that's where you get Christopher Columbus. Even though Christopher Columbus, I believe, was ethnically what we would call now Italian, he was hired by the Spanish crown to try to find another sea route to India. So he thought, he could go around the globe and get to it that way, get to not only India, but also the Indies, which, a lot of which was like what we would now call Indonesia. But instead, of course, he stumbled upon the Americas. And so that started a whole new phase. And then, later on, you get Ferdinand Magellan, who does the first circumnavigation of the globe, dies in the Philippines, was killed by an important warlord and leader in the Philippines. Only a fraction of his crew makes it all the way back. So this is in 1519 to 1522. And so that's kind of how the Americas got brought into this world system, even though they had trade going on amongst themselves throughout the Americas. And something that really began to change the game was sugar. Now, I believe I go into this in more detail in one of the other lectures. Let me just see. But before I talk about sugar, let me mention one of the other reasons for excitement about the Americas was that one of the most desirable trading partners for Europe at the time was China. The most economically powerful and most vast powers, some of the most vast powers in the world at that time were in India and in China. And China had many more desirable goods from a European perspective than Europeans did for the Chinese. So there became a trading deficit where Europeans continued to want silks and porcelain that we call China, and spices and other things from China. And because the Europeans didn't have as much to offer the Chinese that they actually wanted, the Chinese demanded payment to make up for that deficit in gold and silver. And none of these European powers necessarily controlled enough supplies of gold or silver for that hunger. So they got it in other places. One of the places they did was in West Africa. The country of Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. So that was one of the places that they got it. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were extremely hopeful that they could basically plunder the Americas for gold. And their desire was not so much to completely move their citizens there and completely colonize, but they wanted to extract resources like gold. And then sugar starts to come into the picture. And I will post these videos separately on sugar rather than making you watch them here. But sugar was something that had been known in parts of Southeast Asia and in India for thousands of years. It was domesticated probably between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago, possibly on the island of New Guinea. But it only spread through parts of Southeast Asia and then to India, and then started to filter through Islamic trading routes. Some started to be grown in parts of the Levant, and they even tried it in parts of the Mediterranean and in some islands off the coast of Africa, like in the Azores. But it wasn't something that was uber profitable at first. In fact, in Europe, it was mainly only consumed by the elites because only the elites could afford it, only like the aristocracy or wealthy merchants or whatnot. And sometimes it was conspicuous consumption. They didn't even necessarily consume it all for food. It was an expensive material. So as you'll see in this second video down here, they even used it to make elaborate sculptures just to show off their wealth. However, when the Spanish sort of became disillusioned with their search for vast stores of gold in the Americas, they at the same time began to realize that they could use parts of the Americas, including a lot of Caribbean islands, as plantations for sugar. And so eventually this led to a growth in slavery because if you have wage labor that's growing the sugar cane and processing the sugar cane, obviously that makes it more expensive, and your market is going to be that can afford that is going to be smaller. However, if you get free labor in the form of slavery or indentured servitude, then that keeps your cost of production way low, so you can kind of reap greater profits by doing that. So the plantation system is really the beginning of the major slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. I want to mention briefly just one way of looking at how different polities are linked in terms of socioeconomics, and that's called world systems theory. The idea that a system based on wealth and power differentials transcends individual countries, and in the person who's kind of known for developing this is Emanuel Wallerstein, and he came up with sort of this schematic model where he divides up countries into mainly the core and the periphery, but then there's the semi-periphery, and he talks about the core as being the economically most powerful polities that have colonies, perhaps like in the periphery, or at least they get their cheap labor from the periphery, and they get their raw materials from the periphery, that are then maybe manufactured into the final product, something more valuable in the core, and then the core sells it not only within the core but also to the semi-periphery and the periphery. And the semi-periphery is just somewhere in between. Somewhere where they're a bit more economically powerful than the periphery. The labor might not be as cheap from the semi-periphery. They also sell things back to the periphery, although maybe not as much to the core. So you can see a world system developing in this time where the periphery becomes the colonized peoples, the colonized lands, where they're getting cheap or free labor in the form of slavery and raw materials that are then bought by the core. So whether we're talking about sugar or cotton, which ends up being processed into its final product in either what becomes the United States or Great Britain, and then sold back in its final form throughout the world system. And that has a tendency to sort of perpetuate itself. And obviously it can shift over time. And now, China is part of, it might be the semi-periphery, because although it's an economic powerhouse, it also obviously for us provides cheap labor, right? Your Macintosh is built there. I mean, even your PCs are generally built there. Raw materials come from Africa and China, especially things that are needed for circuitry. Mexico is like a semi-periphery. We outsource labor to Mexico, but they also manufacture cars and all kinds of things and sell it back here, and then it gets sold for even more money. So it's just a way to look at how things are tied together. Now, kind of stepping back to retrace this, especially as pertains to sugar, in the 1600s, and like the early 1600s, or up until around that time, most Europeans, grew what they needed to survive. Now, it may have been in a feudal or semi-feudal system, or it was sort of peasantry. But these were largely people who were not consuming a lot of products from elsewhere in the world. Only the elites were really doing that to any appreciable extent. And as I said, sugarcane had been known for thousands of years in various parts of the world, probably domesticated on the island in New Guinea or somewhere in Southeast Asia. And then you have the plantation system eventually, when the sugar that had been known by people in the Mediterranean area, the Spanish, the Portuguese, started to decide to grow that en masse in their new colonies in the New World, and use slave labor to produce that. And you get the plantation system. And then later, cotton becomes dominant, and cotton fuels the Industrial Revolution, and it also fuels an increase in the volume of the slave trade and perpetuates the slave trade, which I will talk about in another lecture. And so here, you'll see this again in some of my other lectures, but this is sort of the triangle trade, the transatlantic slave trade, as pertains to cotton. So what you would get here is, and it's hard to know where to begin the cycle, but let's begin it with taking enslaved Africans to colonies in the Americas to work on plantations growing cotton. Then that raw cotton, some of it from the south of the United States was obviously shipped to factories in the north. A lot of it was sold back to Great Britain, and it was manufactured into cotton textiles in the north of the U.S. and in Great Britain. And then that cotton, that manufactured cotton, was used along with other things such as weapons and metals and European trinkets to purchase slaves from trading posts in Africa. So this was a self-perpetuating cycle where you have the Africans growing the cotton, and then you have other Africans buying the cotton, and a lot of the people who are profiting from that are wealthier merchants and industrial captains in the United States and in Western Europe, in particular at this point in Great Britain. So this just shows the volume overall of the Atlantic slave trade in terms of where most of the enslaved Africans were taken. So you see 35% in total went to Brazil and some other places in South America and in Central America. 60% went to the West Indies. So we're talking about Haiti, we're talking about Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then 5% to the southern United States. And obviously the majority came from West Africa and Southwest Africa, but there were some also from East Africa as well, in Madagascar. This is a video that you don't need to watch. It's actually too long, and I go over most of what you would need to know anyway. But so that kind of starts us on this journey. In the next one, I'll talk about the growth of the concept of race, and we'll continue on from there. Okay, so I hope this wasn't too long. I will see you soon. Take care.